The day James Mark was born, the city of Lagos glittered brighter than usual. From the rooftop of the private hospital, fireworks painted the night in bursts of silver and gold. The skyline echoed with laughter, champagne corks, and the rhythm of joy. Inside the luxury suite, Judith Mark held her newborn son close, tears slipping down her cheeks. Years of childlessness had carved silent scars in her heart. Prayers, pilgrimages, and whispers of pity had followed her everywhere. But tonight, all of that was gone. "He's perfect," she whispered, brushing a finger across the baby's soft cheek. "Our James, our strength." Her husband, Chief Mark, stood by the window, dressed in white silk, the glow of pride softening the lines of his face. To the world, he was a man of steel, the billionaire who rose from nothing, who once sold bread on the dusty streets of Onitsha before building an empire of oil and steel. But tonight, he was just a man, undone by the fragile beauty of a child. "God has blessed us," he said quietly, "and I promise my son will never suffer what I suffered. He will have the world." He meant it. And when Chief Mark made promises, the world shifted to make them real. Within weeks, the nursery was transformed into a royal chamber. Imported Italian furniture, golden trimmings, an automated cradle that played Mozart, and a soft carpet thick enough to hide a coin. Judith hired the best nannies from abroad, trained in childcare, nutrition, and etiquette. A private doctor visited daily, charting every breath, every heartbeat. James never cried for long. The slightest sound from his crib brought a small army running. If he coughed, they called the doctor. If he frowned, they summoned a psychologist. If he laughed, they threw a party. "Let him have everything," Judith would say, her eyes gleaming with maternal pride. "Why should he lack anything when we have enough for the world?" As the months turned into years, the mansion became a kingdom revolving around one small boy. At 2, he rode a gold-trimmed tricycle down the marble halls. At 3, he had a playroom filled with imported toys, each costing more than his father's first car. At 4, he had his own driver, his own chef, and his own security detail. To his parents, it was love. To James, it was normal. When he began to speak, his words carried the innocence of privilege. "Mom, I want the moon." Judith laughed and kissed his forehead. "If it were for sale, my son, your father would buy it." And she wasn't wrong. For Chief Mark, every desire was a challenge. If money could make his son smile, then no price was too high. Every whim was granted before it was even spoken. But behind the smiles and the silks, a small distance began to form, the kind that wealth builds quietly. James's world was too soft, too clean. He never knew what it meant to fall, to scrape a knee, to be told no. Every problem disappeared before it touched him. One afternoon, when he was 6, a gardener's son visited the mansion. The boy, barefoot and dusty, had come to deliver a message. James, curious, approached him with wide eyes. "Why don't you have shoes?" he asked. The gardener's son shrugged. "My dad says we'll buy when he gets paid." James blinked. The idea was foreign to him. "Can't your dad just tell his bank to bring money?" The other boy laughed. "Bank? My dad, no. Get bank." That day, for the first time, James saw something money could not buy: the raw simplicity of a life without it. But before he could ask more, a servant pulled him away, scolding, "Don't mix with outsiders, young master." And just like that, The glass bubble closed again. By the time James turned 12, the world had already begun to whisper his name. Newspapers called him the future of the Mark dynasty. His father's associates nodded approvingly at his perfect English, his polite handshake, and the expensive wristwatch that gleamed on his small wrist. To outsiders, he was a young prince being raised for greatness. Inside the mansion, he was a boy surrounded by glass, protected, adored, and unknowingly alone. The Mark mansion in Ikoyi had grown with him. What began as a family home had become a marble fortress. There was a private cinema, a miniature zoo, an indoor swimming pool, and an entire wing dedicated to James's education. His tutors came from abroad: a French linguist, a British historian, and a retired professor of economics who had once taught at Oxford. His schedule was designed to sculpt him into a prodigy. 7 a.m. private fitness training, 8 a.m. breakfast, and world news briefing with his father. 9 a.m. lessons, mathematics, French, economics, leadership studies. 2 p.m. lunch with his mother and etiquette coach. 4 p.m. piano and chess practice. 6 p.m. dinner, followed by reflection hour. To his parents, it was preparation. To James, it was a golden cage. When he looked through the mansion's high windows, he could see the city stretching below, crowded, noisy, alive. He often watched children playing football in the dusty streets near the gate, their laughter ringing through the hot evening air. They seemed free in a way he could never be. Once, he asked his father, "Dad, why can't I play outside with them?" Chief Mark looked up from his laptop, adjusting his glasses. "Because, my son, those are not your mates. You belong to a different world. A world where you must command, not follow." James nodded quietly, though his eyes drifted back toward the laughter outside. By 15, James had already begun attending business meetings beside his father. He would sit silently, observing men twice his age bow their heads as Chief Mark spoke. They called his father the Lion of Lagos, a man whose word could shift markets. After each meeting, his father would place a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You must learn to be feared and respected, James. Wealth without control is weakness." "Yes, Dad," he would reply, though something inside him twisted each time. He didn't want to be feared. He wanted to be understood. Judith noticed his quietness, the way he spent long hours staring out his window. She assumed it was just the weight of responsibility. "He's growing into a man," she would say proudly. "You can see the wisdom in his eyes." But wisdom was not what filled his thoughts. It was emptiness. He began to question things. Why his father's workers bowed so deeply? Why his mother's laughter always sounded rehearsed? Why their mansion felt colder with each passing year? It happened one evening during a charity gala held in their ballroom. The chandeliers glittered, violins played, and the air was rich with perfume and money. James stood beside his parents, smiling dutifully as guests congratulated them on their remarkable son. But midway through the evening, he began to feel dizzy. The lights blurred. His breath grew shallow. He tried to speak, but his words slurred. Then everything went black. Screams followed. Glass shattered. Someone shouted, "Call the doctor." He woke hours later in his room, the smell of medicine thick in the air. Judith was by his side, her makeup streaked with tears. "My son, you scared me," she cried, clutching his hand. The doctor said it was exhaustion. You've been studying too hard. Chief Mark nodded grimly. Yes, rest for now. Tomorrow, we'll have a specialist flown in from London. I won't take chances. The next day, 5 doctors arrived. They ran tests, murmured in low tones, and reassured the family that it was nothing serious. Just stress and low blood sugar, one said politely, accepting the heavy envelope the chief discreetly handed him. The episode was forgotten by everyone except James. He remembered the fear. The moment his body failed him, how helpless he felt. It was the first time in his life that something didn't bend to his will. No amount of money or command could stop it. In the years that followed, James's fainting spells returned occasionally, subtle at first, then more frequent. His parents blamed late nights and long study hours. His father grew impatient each time a doctor mentioned further tests. My son is fine, Chief Mark would roar. Do you know how many people depend on me? Don't waste my time with your guesses. He will outgrow it. But James knew something wasn't right. His body felt foreign. His hands sometimes trembled without cause. His heart raced after minor exertion. When he mentioned it, his mother's eyes would glaze with denial. Don't say such things, my dear, she would whisper. You are strong. You are your father's son. So he said nothing more. Instead, he smiled for photographs, attended charity events, and appeared in glossy magazines as the heir to one of Nigeria's greatest fortunes. And yet, when the cameras flashed, he felt like a ghost behind his own smile. The year James turned 17, the mansion grew quieter. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the heavy stillness that settles when something unspoken lingers in the air. The servants moved softly, the laughter of past years replaced by cautious whispers. James's fainting spells had become more frequent, and his once radiant strength had begun to fade. Yet, in public, the Mark family maintained their flawless image, wealth polished to perfection. No one outside the house knew the truth. Judith, Chief Mark said one morning, pacing their gold-lined living room, I think these doctors are exaggerating. They say his blood counts are low, but that can't be serious. He's strong, just overworked. His wife sat on the couch, twisting her rosary. They said it could be something in his blood. Chief, maybe something inherited. Inherited? He snapped. From who? My father lived to 90. You think money can build an empire and not protect my son? Impossible. He slammed his palm on the marble table. The sound echoed like a gavel of denial. Judith flinched, but said nothing more. She had begun to pray more often, slipping into the chapel they had built behind the house. The scent of incense clung to her clothes. She would light candles and whisper James's name over and over. But each morning, when she saw her son's pale face, her prayers felt smaller. James tried to hide the symptoms. He didn't want to worry his mother, and he knew his father hated weakness. He'd wake up dizzy, his body trembling with exhaustion. His legs would ache from walking short distances. His once bright eyes were now dull with fatigue. One afternoon, while his tutor explained market trends, his vision blurred again. He reached for his glass of water, but it slipped and shattered on the floor. Sir, are you all right? The tutor asked, startled. I'm fine, James muttered, forcing a smile. Just tired. But when the tutor left, he sank into his chair, trembling. His body wasn't his own anymore. It had become a stranger wearing his face. That night, when he removed his shirt, he noticed how thin he had become. His ribs pressed faintly through his skin. In the mirror, his reflection looked fragile, almost ghostly. He remembered his father's words. "You must always look strong, my son. The world bows only to power." So, he straightened his shoulders, even as his chest burned with pain. It happened a month later. His condition worsened, fevers that came and went, nights filled with pain in his joints, and a metallic taste in his mouth. Finally, Judith insisted they travel abroad for proper tests. The city was cold and grey, far from the humid air of Lagos. Doctors ran tests for days. Machines hummed. Needles pricked his skin. His parents waited in silence, holding hands for the first time in years. When the lead physician finally entered the room, his eyes were careful, too careful. "Mr. and Mrs. Mark," he began, "your son has a rare blood disorder. It's progressive. I'm afraid it's been developing for years, unnoticed. At this stage," he paused, glancing at the floor. "At this stage, there is no cure. We can only manage the symptoms." The words shattered something in the air. Judith gasped. Chief Mark stood up sharply, his voice rising like thunder. "No cure? Do you know who you're talking to? I'll pay whatever it costs. Fly in whoever you need." The doctor sighed gently. "I'm sorry, sir. Money can help with comfort, not with this disease." For the first time in his life, Chief Mark was speechless. Back in Lagos, everything felt different. The mansion was the same, spotless, glowing, but it had lost its warmth. The chandeliers seemed dimmer, the air heavier. James spent more time in bed now, surrounded by machines that hummed quietly through the night. Judith refused to leave his side. She would feed him by hand, stroke his hair, and whisper prayers into his ear. Chief Mark, meanwhile, threw himself into a frenzy of desperation. He summoned herbalists, prophets, and scientists. He offered blank checks to anyone who promised hope. He mortgaged part of his empire to fund experimental treatments. He even flew a controversial healer from Asia who claimed to rebalance energy through gold. Nothing worked. Each week, James grew weaker. His voice faded to a whisper. The boy who once commanded servants with a gesture now struggled to lift a spoon. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, James called his father into the room. "Dad," he said softly, "you look tired." His father tried to smile. "I'm fine, my son. I'm fighting for you." James nodded. "You've always fought, but maybe this one isn't a fight we can win." Chief Mark froze, the words cutting deeper than he expected. "Don't say that," he whispered. James looked up at him, his eyes calm and wise beyond his years. "Dad, have you ever thought that maybe we don't own everything? That maybe life doesn't listen to money?" The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Chief Mark turned away, but his shoulders shook the first crack in the armor of the man the world called unbreakable. The months after the London trip were a blur of phone calls, flights, and invoices. Doctors came and went. Consultants flew in from Germany, India, America. The mansion became a hospital in disguised machines humming in the hallways. The smell of disinfectant, blending with the usual perfume of fresh lilies that Judith insisted must never be missing. Chief Mark stopped attending board meetings. His directors whispered that the empire was running itself now, factories slowing, contracts slipping. Yet he refused to care. What is an empire? He told himself, without an air. Each morning he sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of reports from research centers around the world. His eyes, once sharp, were now red-rimmed from sleeplessness. He circled paragraphs, underlined experimental treatments, sent urgent emails that began with "Price is not an issue." He spoke little to anyone except his private secretary. Charter a flight to Boston. Harvard has a trial on gene therapy. Bring their lead scientist to Lagos. Or find the herbal doctor they mentioned in Kenya. I'll meet him myself. Money moved faster than reason. He spent millions in weeks. Shareholders called for meetings. His oldest friend and lawyer, Barrister John, finally confronted him. "Chief, you're tearing down everything you built," the lawyer said quietly. "Your son needs peace, not chaos." Chief Mark glared at him. "He needs life, John, and life costs money. I will spend every kobo if it means he breathes another day." John bowed his head, knowing no argument could reach him now. While her husband waged war with science, Judith sought refuge in faith. She filled the mansion's chapel with candles and rosaries, invited priests, prophets, and prayer warriors. Every evening, their voices rose through the corridors, songs of healing, the clap of hands, the echo of amen. But when the prayers ended and everyone went home, she would sit by James's bed, holding his thin hand, whispering, "Stay with me, my child, just stay." He would smile faintly. "Mom, it's okay. You pray so hard, I think heaven must be tired of hearing my name." She would force a laugh, but her eyes betrayed her. She had aged 10 years in months. The once lively home grew quiet. Servants moved like ghosts. The grand piano in the living room gathered dust. Outside, the city's noise continued, indifferent to the tragedy behind the high walls. James spent most days by his window, wrapped in blankets, watching rain slide down the glass. Sometimes he saw children playing beyond the gate and smiled wistfully. When his father entered the room, he would hide his pain, sitting up straight. "Dad," he would say, "you should rest." "I'll rest when you're well," the chief would reply automatically. But each visit became shorter. The man who once dominated boardrooms now trembled in his son's presence. He could face competitors and politicians, but not the look of quiet acceptance in James's eyes. By mid-year, the empire was bleeding. Contracts were cancelled, workers unpaid. A journalist published an article titled "The Billionaire Who Disappeared." Rumors swirled that Chief Mark was ill or bankrupt or mad. One afternoon, Barrister John came again with documents. "Chief," he said gently, "if you sell the Port Harcourt plant, you can fund another year of treatment, but after that, there will be nothing left." The chief stared at the papers. His hand trembled as he signed. "Then another year it is," he muttered. "If I can buy time, I'll buy it." That night, Judith found him in the study, head in his hands. On the desk lay photos of James as a baby, laughing, reaching out, eyes full of life. For the first time, she saw tears on her husband's face. "Judith," he whispered, voice breaking. "All my life I believed money could bend the world. But what good is it now? I would trade every naira just to see him run again. She knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. Then stop fighting the storm, my husband. Sit with him. Let him feel your love, not your power. The next morning, Chief Mark did something he hadn't done in years. He left his study and sat by his son's bedside, quietly. No doctors, no assistants, just father and son. James turned weakly toward him. Dad, you came early. Yes, my son, he said, forcing a smile. Today, I'm not working. Today, I just want to talk. For hours, they spoke about childhood, about the smell of rain, about the boy James once saw playing barefoot outside the gates. The chief listened, really listened, for the first time in his life. At one point, James said softly, Dad, do you think people are happier when they have everything? The chief hesitated. I used to think so. And now? He looked at his son, eyes wet. Now I think people are happy when they have peace. The mansion had never been this quiet. Once it was a living monument, servants bustling through its halls, chefs preparing feasts for endless guests, the sound of laughter spilling from the ballroom. But now, it was a house that breathed softly, as though afraid to disturb its own grief. The only constant sound was the faint beeping of machines in James's room. Months had passed since the last doctor left. Chief had stopped searching for new treatments. Hope hadn't died in one moment. It had withered slowly, like a candle burning itself out. Chief Mark rarely left the house. He dismissed his security escorts, closed his offices, and avoided calls from the few friends who still tried to reach him. The empire, once a kingdom of power, was now just numbers in a computer screen, unattended, fading. Judith had grown frail. Her once glowing face was pale, her elegant dresses replaced by plain wrappers. She no longer hosted prayer gatherings or charity teas. Her fate had become quiet, reduced to a whisper each morning when she placed her palm on her son's chest to feel if he was still breathing. James had changed too. His body was weak, but his mind was clear, sharper than ever. He no longer feared the truth. He had made peace with it. He spent long hours by the window, watching the world he had never truly known. Children still ran past the mansion's gate, laughing, playing football in the dust. Their voices reached his window like echoes from another life. One day, he called his mother. Mom, do you remember the boy who came here when I was small, the gardener's son? Judith looked confused for a moment, then nodded slowly. I used to wonder, James continued, smiling faintly, if he ever got those shoes he wanted. I thought money made people safe, but I think he was happier barefoot than I ever was in silk. Judith felt her heart crack, but she said nothing. She simply brushed his hair back and whispered, You were happy, my son. We made sure of that. He looked at her gently. You tried, Mom. You both did. But maybe we built too many walls. Chief Mark had stopped roaring. His voice, once the thunder of boardrooms, had become a whisper. He spent his days sitting near his son's bed, listening to the rhythm of the oxygen machine. Sometimes, he would tell old stories how he slept under bridges as a boy, how he sold bread in traffic. Did you ever cry back then, Dad? James asked one evening. He smiled bitterly. I didn't have time to cry. I thought if I became rich enough, I'd never have to feel that kind of pain again. And did it work? Chief Mark looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, my son. The rich cry too, only, when they do, their tears fall in empty houses. James reached for his father's hand, squeezing weakly. Then, don't let them be empty anymore, Dad. Those words stayed with the chief long after his son had fallen asleep. By now, James could barely walk. His world had narrowed to his bed, the window, and the soft voices of his parents. The disease had taken much, but it had also stripped away everything false, leaving only love, quiet and real. One morning, as the sun poured through the curtains, he asked to be taken to the garden. It took 2 servants and a wheelchair, but they brought him there beneath the mango tree that had stood in the yard since before he was born. The air was cool. The scent of wet earth filled his lungs. For a moment, he closed his eyes and smiled. I didn't know the world smelled this beautiful, he murmured. Judith knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. Chief Mark stood behind, silent, his hand resting on her shoulder. They stayed like that for hours. No machines, no noise, just the sound of leaves rustling above them. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Judith woke to a strange stillness. She ran to her son's room. He was awake, his eyes soft, breathing shallow. Mom, he whispered, don't cry when I'm gone. Please, tell Dad. It's all right. She clutched his hand, shaking her head, her voice breaking. Don't say that. You'll get better. He smiled faintly. No, Mom. I'm already better. I'm free. And with that, he exhaled slowly, like a sigh of relief. The monitor flatlined. A sound escaped Judith that the mansion had never heard before. A raw, wordless cry that carried through the halls and out into the night. When Chief Mark rushed in, he didn't ask questions. He didn't shout. He simply fell to his knees beside his wife, holding his son's still hand. For the first time in his life, the man who owned everything felt what it was to have nothing. The morning after James's passing, Lagos woke as it always did, horns blaring, engines humming, the restless rhythm of a city chasing its own shadow. Inside Chief Mark Mansion, time had stopped. The air was heavy with incense and silence. White flowers surrounded the bed where he had lain. Servants moved like ghosts, their faces wet with quiet tears. For years they had served him, bowed to him, carried out every command. Now they knelt beside his still body, whispering prayers. Judith sat by the bedside, motionless. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket as though it were sacred cloth. She hadn't spoken since the night before. Every so often, she would touch his forehead, hoping the warmth would return. Chief Mark stood near the window, staring at the dawn light spilling over the city skyline. For decades, he had greeted the sunrise as a challenge, a promise that the world was his to conquer. This morning, the light felt like judgment. The funeral was grand because everything about the Marks had always been grand. The street outside the mansion overflowed with cars, ministers, governors, and business moguls dressed in white, cameras flashing, journalists whispering about the tragedy of wealth. A choir sang. The priest spoke of heaven, of peace, of rest. Chief Mark barely heard a word. He felt only the weight of the coffin lowering into the earth, the final thud of soil striking the lid. Judith collapsed once, crying his name. He caught her, holding her as if she were the last fragile thing in the world. When the mourners left, they stayed behind, alone beside the grave. The marble headstone gleamed under the setting sun. James Mark 2002-2025, Our Strength Forever. The chief knelt, pressing his palm against the cool stone. "Forgive me, my son," he whispered. "I gave you everything except the world beyond these walls." Weeks turned into months. The mansion remained, but its echoes had changed. The laughter of servants returned only in whispers. The piano was silent, the pool untouched, the garden overgrown. One morning, Barrister John came again, files in hand. "Chief, the board wants to know your decision. The company is in decline. We can salvage what's left if..." "I'm not interested," the chief said quietly. John hesitated. "You built this empire with your own hands." He nodded. "Yes, and my hands buried my son. Let it go, John." He signed over most of his shares that day, the pen shaking in his fingers. He kept only one small company, a medical charity newly founded in his son's name. Judith found her own way of surviving. She began visiting children's wards, sitting with mothers who couldn't afford treatment. She would bring food, blankets, and medicine, listening to their stories. One nurse recognized her once and gasped, "Madam Mark, you shouldn't be here." Judith smiled softly. "Where else should I be? I had one child. Now I sit with the ones who are left." Her visits became frequent. Some evenings she came home with the scent of disinfectant still on her hands, eyes swollen but calmer. She told her husband, "When I hold those children, I feel James is near. Maybe that's what he wanted to teach us, how to give, not just to spend." He said nothing, but for the first time in months, he took her hand. A year later, the chief returned to the same garden where James had last asked to sit. The mango tree was heavy with fruit. The air was warm, the same orange light spilling across the sky. He sat on the same bench, closing his eyes. He could almost hear his son's voice, calm, gentle. "People are happy when they have peace." He smiled faintly. For the first time since the boy's death, he didn't feel rage or grief, just a quiet acceptance. The empire was gone, but the weight on his chest was lighter. Judith joined him, carrying a small framed photo of their son. They sat together, watching the sun sink into the horizon. "He always loved this light," she whispered. The chief nodded. "Yes, it was my sunrise and my sunset." They said nothing more. The evening breeze moved through the leaves, and somewhere beyond the walls, children laughed the same sound James once longed to join.